I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to Sweetwater's Guitars and Gear. This time out, our special guest, James Santiago from Universal Audio. Thanks for coming in, man.
Glad to be here, man.
Good to see you. Senior Product Manager.
Sounds fancy. Just means I get to play with guitar gear all day.
Well, geez, that's a okay gig.
A dream gig, yeah. Yeah. I would have done it anyway, but don't tell them that.
Right.
So, yeah.
So you've been working in the industry for a long time.
Yeah. I've sort of had this weird love affair with vintage gear, but also the process of how to modernize that. So I've had one foot in my closet full of old burnt up tube amps that barely work and tape echoplexes, and then, you know, starting with line 6, really trying to find ways to make tools that at least gave you some of that vibe. Mm-hmm. And then a few years ago, got involved with Bill Putnam Jr. and the great folks over at UA, as they wanted to really delve into proper, I'd say, recording interfaces, and then really giving guitar players a place to put their instrument.
Right.
So this is the first real product from UA done in-house for guitar players, which I'm really honored to be a part of.
So what we're talking about here is the 55 Deluxe plug-in for the Apollo platform.
Yeah.
And I want to come back to that, but first, we've been doing some real guitar geekery here, sitting around.
Right.
Tell us about this guitar you've got with you.
Okay. Oh, so this guitar I found thanks to my friend Josh Smith and Norman Harris, who we all know from Norm's Rare Guitars. Mm-hmm. If you've ever seen the Spinal Tap movie, which I think all of us have, that whole pile of guitars that don't even touch it with the tagger on it, those all came from Norm. So he's got this legendary status of finding these great instruments. And as I have a 55 Deluxe of my own that I use a lot, and I just found this guitar, which happened to be around 56. So it just felt like the right time to kind of finally have the pair. And I've had a bunch of guitars, but this is the one that a number of my other guitars had to go bye-bye for.
Yeah. So this is an original 56 Strat.
Yeah, an original 56. This is the pretty much probably as you would have bought it, minus the pickguard warping and some other funny things. But to be careful with it, there's a distinction between collecting guitars and playing guitars, as we all know. And I went to a guy named Joe Glazer in Nashville, who does like Vince Gill and every great collector but player.
Sure.
So like if you're going to make this guitar playable, you know, he did some fret work and put in a nice new nut and plecked it, which is a neat process. So you can actually bend strings.
Oh, it plays incredibly.
Yeah, so it's been a fun guitar to have, and again, came at the right time of through the end of the development of the amp to feel, you know, if you think about, well, if you went into a Fender dealer and you bought the package, if you went in 56, you would have bought this guitar and that would have been your amp. And
right.
So I feel very lucky to actually have the pair now. Although, honestly, the plug-in, you know, during development, we used every guitar you probably could have imagined. So I pulled out everything from, you know, battery-powered EMGs with Floyd Roses. There's your, you know, we had to go through the 80s, and then 335s, Telecasters, Stratocasters, Les Pauls.
Right.
Because I think for me, that's my favorite amp because the amp can sound different depending on the guitar you put into it. Mm-hmm. So why this is like one of my favorite guitars, it's always a treat to plug in a beautiful semi-hollow guitar and see what it does to it, or a Les Paul and do a Neil Young thing where it's just breaking apart. So I think the thing is, I'm just a big geek for all of this. So
that's awesome.
Again, just happy to have the guitar, and it came into my life thanks to some friends, and to have something to, you know, kind of, I think we all fall in love with one guitar. And when you find it, you try not to lose it. So this is the one for me at the moment.
That is a beauty. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And we've been having a bunch of the guys from here at Sweetwater have been in checking it out, because that is a sweet guitar.
It's a player's guitar, not to be played for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So speaking of playing, the 55 Deluxe plug-in is incredible. Tell us a little bit about where this came from. What was the idea behind this?
Well, UA had a deal with Fender in place. It's been a number of years since it was started and developed, and it came down to looking at the history of recorded guitar. And when you think about what Fender had done, this 55 Deluxe was right at the time Leo decided to start making guitars in the first place. Mm-hmm. So this was one of his first real guitar amp designs. And then for me, as I do my research into the studio scene, because UA has such a deep history with studio, thanks to Bill Putnam Sr. And all those Western studio development, 1176s, everything he developed. It's like, well, what would be the one amp that Fender did early on that had such a sort of historic thing in the studio? And for me, everything landed back at this Deluxe. Because as I look at the history of stuff, and I always have to remind folks that this amp came out at a time when there were no active pickup guitars, there weren't pedals. You had a guitar, you had an amp, and if you wanted it to distort, you had to just kind of turn the amp up.
Right.
And this amp was just loud enough to cut the drummer and actually have the sort of vibey, squishy tubes doing their thing. And then you realize, like, oh, there's a reason for that. That you get this sort of feedback. You play lighter, the amp doesn't distort as much. You play harder, it crumbles. And those are things when you read interviews with like Neil Young, or you talk to guys like Larry Carlton, some of their biggest songs were recorded with just that amp. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, it's like, what's the clean sound? Well, you roll down your volume.
Right.
And same thing with Neil Young going as far as making a box again to turn the knobs for him, which I think he still uses actually, the Whizzer.
Right.
And then Larry Carlton, having a 335. Like every Steely Dan record, I mean, as we think of classic studio recordings, I think everyone probably still tests their stereo out with Josie.
Right.
That record.
Right, and that's that tone.
And that's that tone. If you play harder with the 335 with nothing on that amp, well, minus Larry's hands, you'll get the same rig. Mm-hmm. And then, Billy Gibbons is, love affair. Daniel Lanois is another guy really into these amps, and I just felt like it was a really good pairing for UA to do, I think, for me, one of the most revered studio amps in history. Right. And to have UA make this our sort of first launch.
Right. So did you have one, you mentioned you own one of these amps. Was that the one that you used for this, or did you go to find other amps, or how did you voice this? Yeah,
we have two of them actually. I have one stock one from 55, and that one took a number of months to find a second one. And my goal wasn't to find one that was just, like, had to be 55. I actually didn't care what year it was. It just had to have all of the things that made Neil Young want to play it, that made Larry want to play it, that made Billy Gibbons, do clean sounds with it. So I'm based in Los Angeles, so I basically hunted all over town, and I played through so many of these amps. Some of them really great, but had blown speakers, had reconed, had modifications in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. And I finally got down to finding a second one that I thought just really did everything. And I had rooms full of these things. And, it wasn't the prettiest looking model. We called it the comb over. Is that somebody had ripped a tweed, and it just had this, little afro sitting on top of it of tweed hair. But it sounded phenomenal, and somebody had gigged with it and played it a lot. And it had the original speaker, and I popped the back open, and the wiring hadn't been touched. It had the original filter caps, tubes. And I was like, okay, it's not pretty, but it's a player. It's just like this guitar was. It's got dings and scratches from somebody playing it. Because as we all know, there's also a second thing of, there's one thing to have an amp that's, what we would call new old stock and never been played, and it may look great, but there's a soul that sort of happens to these amps as they deteriorate, as they sort of wear out. It's a better term for it.
As they mature,
yes. Excuse my lack of coffee this morning. But as they sort of wear, there's a point where they sound great before they die. It's trying to get them before they're dead.
Right.
And that presented another challenge because, having two of these, it was a couple of years of work on this amp. So, I never wanted to leave this thing on 10 hours a day. So it was a matter of having a couple of my own plus the second, which I think are, again, they're in our studio. They're actually living in the studio that the plug-in looks like. So mm-hmm. That is our Universal Audio Studio 610 room.
That's awesome.
Those microphones. So I enjoy just playing the real amp, but then I think for me, at the end of it, the final tests for this were really, when you plug into this and you're not looking at the computer, do you get the vibe that you're playing that amp in the control room with the amp in the live room? And just so you know, that was our final test. That was the final sign-off, was literally this, taking a cable, and I had a little AB box. And one literally went to the front of one of these. The other side went to the real amp sitting in the control room, going to the second one we had with the speaker in it, mic'd up, brought back into the control room through the monitors, and you just AB switched it. To the point where we knew we had it, where you actually had to look up and go like, well, which one am I on? I don't know anymore.
Wow.
And that's what took years, instead of just, it was never is it good enough? It was like, it's a term we call unit-to-unit variation. Does it sound like one of the two originals? At the point you can't tell one of the two, you kind of got to, I would keep going forever if they would have let me, but it sounded like the other two, and that's what I had to stop.
Well, that's a testimony not only to obviously the programming that went into the plug-in and all the effort that you guys put into that, but also the Unison technology that works inside the Apollo interfaces and gets the impedance right and gets the feel of the guitar plugged in correct.
That was a huge one. In fact, sort of the input matrix here, there's each one of those, as Fender had designed it, either has an attenuation, so you're knocking out 3 dB here and there, and the input impedance, which, as we click things around here, you actually can hear the set of relays physically changing the input impedance of that. So when I don't know if you can hear that, but it's actually changing the front end. So for with guitars, especially these kinds of guitars with, single coil pickups, or just passive guitars that are just a cable going to the front end of something, you can really affect the way your high end translates. And sometimes it's not what you hear, but it's what you feel. It's that first transient and how it lays into something that can make you feel like, well, that feels beautiful, or it feels like you're hitting a brick wall.
Right.
And that was one of the weird things, was making sure that when you nailed it. In fact, let me pull up a preset that actually has the Y cable in it. The Y cable was actually a Model 2 from a vintage early 70s Y cable I had. The impedance splits and all of this stuff, all that to me, when I dig into with the pick, it's like, the way the volume rolls down, how it gets dark, is exactly the way the front end of that real amp would have worked. So it's, if you were to measure it, it measures just like the real amp, which would be a 500 ohm input at that point with the split. But I'm going to get too far in the rabbit hole.
That's pretty tweaky right there, but that's the kind of stuff that makes this super realistic.
Yeah. There's a thing that if you just had a DI box and we're going into the plug-in, it wouldn't sound bad. But if you're just really a guitar-centric person and you get inspired by great tones and how things feel, just the guitar cable with the front of that, it should feel like you're playing the amp mic'd up in the room.
Right.
That's the whole goal, is like all of these switches and all of these tone controls should get the same feedback from the front end of that it did from the real amp. So we made sure it did.
That's awesome. So before we explore some of the other features here, let's go through some of the presets and check out some of the sounds that the plug-in can do.
Yeah, so here's a fun one here. This was sort of my fun way to get sort of classic, late 60s sort of cranked up sounds. And an interesting thing to note here is like the two controls I'm on, that's the volume and the tone, they're just turned all the way to 12. And there's a little extra feature we added here, which lets you pick the speaker. And I noticed this, I used to do this to my own stuff and a number of other guys around Los Angeles, other studio guys. Like one favorite mod for rock guys was, pull out the Jensen, which you were going to blow anyway, honestly.
Right.
You were going to blow it at some point, and they'd put in a Celestion. So it would become sort of a mini sort of English sort of rock rig. And even historically, when we think about great amps like Marshall, even Marshall took some other early designs from these same Fender amps.
Sure.
So you can give some of these amps at least a British flavor just by switching to a Celestion.
And you can do that with this switch here at the top.
Yeah. So the original is marked over here. So that's the original 1955 Jensen P12R, which again we have stocks of them. We measured and went through. The middle one is an odd flavor of Fender designed JBL. It was an orange back JBL D120F. And you would have found that for guys like in the 70s who were putting these high-powered speakers in little tiny amps. And then the last one being just a straight-up Celestion 25-watt greenback.
Right.
So if I play it now, it kind of has like a mini sort of half stack and a combo sound. Not in any way to replace a Marshall sound, but it gives you a little bit of that flavor. Kind of like that.
Nice.
And if I just move it over to a different speaker, go back to the Jensen. A lot of that mid-rangey low end is kind of gone. The Jensen just doesn't have it. That's which is why it's such a great clean speaker, because it's all high end and this sort of sub bottom end. And if actually, I'll just go to the JBL for you. This tends to have a more nasally sound because it's sort of a flat response speaker. But that one's really there to give you just a third wild card flavor.
Right.
But so here's the fun thing with this is even in situations, in fact, I'll go back to the Jensen here. With that amp on 12, one of the great things about the Deluxe is I can just use my volume control to get it to clean up. So you can do the lead thing, which is again the Neil Young or even Larry Carlton thing where you can play a... You can tell if I hit it really, really hard, it actually sort of crumbles.
Right.
And I should explain that at some point during development, you decide, like, well, are we going to put in all the bad things the amp actually does? and UA's sort of motto has been, you know, if the original does it, the plugin has to as well. So
that's cool.
Yeah, if you really nail this, even with just the Strat, it will actually start to gate on itself and crumble apart. So I've probably spent a few hundred hours listening to amps dying at that volume. But
right. So give us a couple other presets here.
Yeah. So we have a little stack in here, and if I just pull up, let's say if we go to Cinnamon 60s Girl, a lot of the tonal things are happening from the combination of mics. So with the funny thing, like we talked about earlier, one of the greatest things about this amp is it's almost hard to get a bad sound. There's only really two controls. You have a tone control and a volume. So if you want it more distorted, you turn volume up, and if you want it brighter, you turn the tone control up. So any kind of like bottom end or high end shaping we do with the mic choice. So in this case, we have an original, probably from 63 or 4, M160 ribbon mic,
right,
plus an off-axis U67. So which will have a completely different sound if I just scroll down here and go to the default. While it seems a little boring and plain, one thing that's here it's kind of hard to see from the picture, but you'll notice we went to a 121 and then an SM57, which if you talk to a lot of the guys in Nashville, they will pick these exact two mics, and really for the reason that the 57 historically has no bottom end and all this mid-range, but the 121 has all this low mid-range and this sort of sweet top and bottom that if you blend the two, you kind of get the ultimate single mic sound.
Right.
So in this case, we are using the 121 for the bottom end, and then using the 57 to sort of poke it out of the mid-range. Now if we turn off the 121, the high-end clarity is there, but it just has no meat at the bottom of that.
Right.
And the fun thing with all of this is you can basically go wild and flip through all the different microphones. And the way they're set up, what this picture actually represents is where the mics really went when I put them on the cabinet. And they're all face corrected. So one of the things we know is when you put two mics up on a cab, you can't really just throw them up there. So what we've done is kind of eliminate all the guesswork, so you can't really get in any trouble. So which is, you know, when you have all these mics, you start putting them up, it's like, well, I think that's the right sound, but then you're sitting there with headphones on or moving a microphone 1/8 of an inch, which, you know, typically I think for a lot of us with home studios, you know, you are the engineer, you're also the guitar player, and you're also trying to play a great part for a demo maybe you're working on. So anything to hurry up and get you out of thinking like an engineer and get you back to playing guitar, All these little things were just kind of set up to do that. Like, just click through the mics, you find the one you like, and it shouldn't sound like it's getting comb filtered.
Right.
So.
Now, you went to some lengths to choose the microphones that were used here.
Yeah. There's a set here. If I can hit the list here. And while there are a lot of microphones to choose from, I came down to a set of 5. And for dynamics, we have the 57, which I think is, probably the base. Yeah, I can't see anybody who's ever said a 57 sounds bad unless it's a personal choice. So the 57, even that one, I've been collecting those, and I have one of the first issues, what they used to call Unidyne 3 versions. Mm-hmm. So when you started seeing those in the late 60s and early 70s, if you were Hendrix or Jimmy Page or you saw them somewhere, they were made by Shure Brothers, the Unidyne 3 running around the capsule. I got really nerdy on this for a while. So I had to have the original versions of those capsules.
Right.
So I have one particular one that I used with a number on it. So you would typically test them as well. So that's one of my favorite 57s from that old pile. Mm-hmm. Same thing goes for the 421. If I go to that, the interesting thing with this is you'll notice it's white. Mm-hmm. And I got into some British recording studio stuff for a long time, and I just kept running across these like, why are theirs white? Why don't I see white ones? And you realize that in Europe, when they first came out, they were a different connector. They were pre-XLR. They were called Tugel connectors, and they came out in white. Mm-hmm. So this was one of these fun trips you do after a Frankfurt Messe show, and I was just like, okay, I'm going to find a pair of these. And I found one, and this is an original one from 1962 with the box and the paperwork that I found, and I, again, I always shoot out the microphones I have. So this particular one is my favorite original white 421 guitar mic.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, and next one, Royer 121. The great folks at Royer. Again, just a studio standard.
Yep. Another go-to.
Yep. The next one is another one of these fun mics. Is the M160. You actually notice I'm doing it on and off axis. I'll explain that better in a second. The on and off axis thing. And this mic in particular, in fact, let me go to another preset here, and I'll show you why this is a big deal. One of the interesting things about ribbon mics is they've got this great sound. They smooth out high end. And I had spent some time with Eddie Kramer, and I finally shook it out of him, like, what were you putting on Hendrix's cabinets? And at some point, he finally just said, M160. I wasn't all that smart. I'm like, M160, I don't even know what that is. Mm-hmm. And I started doing my homework, and I realized, like, well, why doesn't that look like the one he had? Another one of those fun things. These mics were done in Europe before XLR was standard. So this has this weird European Tugel connector. It's silver, and it's a ribbon mic. And I kept thinking, I think it's one of the classic Hendrix things, is how does a guy with a Strat with a Marshall on 12 not sound like razor blades?
Right.
And you realize there's all these little filters that are happening. So the microphone being ribbon, which is the same thing you'd find with the 121, it has a smooth high end. Mm-hmm. This mic also has, but it's also really aggressive sounding. And I tied that up to when you talk with engineers from the 60s, they weren't used to doing direct miking either. They typically wouldn't stick the mics right on the speaker like we do now. Like anyone at Abbey Road, if they dared put a 67 right on a guitar cab of Jet Beck's from that era, they would have got slapped.
Right.
A rule, do not put our expensive microphones right up on a cabinet. They'd put them a foot away. So that's where you get sort of the off-axis thing. So it started making more sense, like, okay, so it has to be the ribbon, which is killing some high end, and then it's off-axis as well. So this is one of the fun things. If I take that M160 and I put it on axis, you'll hear all the high end. Off-axis, it immediately changes because of the way that the pattern is on the mic, and it's. And I didn't do anything to the amp.
Right.
And that's one of the things I started finding out as I would lock myself in my room for days with all this gear and recording. You're like, okay, I'm not leaving until I figure this out. Because then you realize that if I had taken the tone control on the amp and turned it down, it would have got less distorted. Mm-hmm. The amp needed to respond like it was cranked up, and the filtering had to happen in the studio, at the microphone, at the speaker.
Okay.
And this is one of the many traps you fall into, and you realize, like, I think as all of us as a guitar player, we learn our craft as best as we can with pedals and cables and guitars and amplifiers. But then once you hit the speaker, sometimes that's where it stops for most folks. Mm-hmm. And I know how many times I sat somewhere going, why can't I really sound like Eruption? Why can't I sound like Andy Summers? What am I missing on my rig? I have the same gear. You realize, like, oh, it's that exact speaker, that microphone, that mic pre, where they put the microphone. That's the other half of the picture.
Right.
So that was a lot of the work. Like, even though it seems like a simple list of microphones, like there's a reason for each one of these mics.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a long-winded way to say I love the M160. It's my favorite guitar mic and has such a historic relevance for me, being the Hendrix mic as well.
Awesome.
And then the last one, before I put everyone to sleep, is the U67. And there have been a few folks that said, well, why not a U47?
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you go back into the logs of recorded guitar records, 47s typically weren't put on guitar amps. Maybe the Beatles, excluding them. But, you know, a U67 was the mic you would have put on, you know, Jeff Beck's guitar amp in the late 60s, early 70s. It would have been the mic, it would have been their equivalent of the box of 57s. Like, well, we're not going to use the 47s, those are for singers, but we got all these 67s. So that's typically what ended up on a lot of guitar cabinets in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And this one in particular, we were able to get from Alan Sides, who was the original Ocean Way studio owner, which in a great way is nice that it comes back to UA, because he bought Ocean Way from Bill Putnam Sr. when it was still called Western.
Right.
So there's a real family sort of thing. Like when it came down, like, I need a 67, it's like, just call Alan. You know, I went down to his studio, he grabbed me a U67 that had #1 on it from Ocean Way. It was still his favorite mic from back then.
Wow.
So that's what actually ended up in here, is that original Ocean Way 67.
Right. Wow. You guys went after every detail.
Yeah, and there's even a beer stain actually somewhere. If you look really closely, there's some sparks there and little drips. So it is all there.
It's all there from the app. That is so awesome. That is so awesome. You have a master output control. You can pan the two microphones as well. So if you want to do a stereo image,
yeah, you can pan them. And another fun thing is, you know, and it actually depends on who you talk to. Some of the guitar workflows are, you know, pairing the mics, and you would usually commit to a mono source and EQ them together. So when I run this, and a number of other like Nashville guys are like, yeah, I used the 121 and 57, but then they always sum to mono, and they always will only stick to that one. But you can have fun if you decide that you don't want to use it like that. You can always throw in the auxiliary bus here, and then just monitor through it. Or if you're in your DAW, you can always, you know, put it in the insert, print the DI in your DAW, and then later on decide to put wild microphones left and right. And pan them around. So you can have a lot of fun with like panning a really dark mic to the left and a really small mic to the right, and getting a little extra stereo image.
Nice. And speaking of workflow, you've got a couple of plugins here on the buses. What are you doing there?
Yeah, one thing I usually do is, and I think it's probably my preference, is there's definitely a difference when you're sitting in front of an amp in a room, and a difference when you're sitting in front of studio monitors. Control rooms are typically pretty dead spaces, and there's nothing worse than the harshness of waking up and realizing it's hard to play when you feel like your head's buried in the amp. Because none of us actually play our guitar amps like that. You know, if I got a 10-foot cable, I'll probably put the amp pointing that way, and you'll hear it coming off a wall. Right. So it depends on if you want to feel like I'm in the control room or in the studio and monitors or headphones, or I want to feel like I'm in the room. So, like, if you were to literally put this amp in the room with you, you would probably be used to putting some of this Ocean Way plug-in. So that, if you put that on the bus, you can definitely feel like you're in the back of the room. Because without it, and if you've ever seen a lot of the documentaries of bands' first day in the recording studio, there's nothing worse than being in the live room going, we killed it! And you walk in the control room and like, wow, I sound like crap. Because there's a mic right on the snare drum, there's a mic right in your speaker, and this is the dry thing, but again, I can verify that mic put in the control room is what that sounds like, straight up. But so I typically I put that on a bus, and that would kind of simulates like if you were playing with a drummer, because you'd probably be spilling into the overheads or something. So you put in a little room, and the only thing I actually like, which this amp is so detailed and dense in the way it sounds. There's a lot of harmonics in the amp that kind of jump out. I typically just put a reverb. So if you put plate reverb on this, in a little room just on the side, you can. it's kind of like I feel like I'm playing the amp now all of a sudden.
Right, really sweet.
Yeah,
really sweet.
I love reverb, but it hides all the mistakes that I'm usually putting in there. You know.
And one of the things I've noticed playing this this plug-in is how touch responsive it is. It really follows what you do with your hands and what you do with the volume knob.
That was probably the last half of the development. Really was the annoying thing that I got into when we were listening to this stuff, and then my response would be, "Man, it sounds perfect, but it doesn't feel quite right yet." I tortured poor Dr. Dave Berners with some of these questions, like, because you can sonically nail something, but there are a lot of things that happen, which include like the Unison stuff, and the way the amp sort of breathes with you, that are things you can't really check until you're actually playing them. And it came down to a point, probably in the last week of development, where I sat with the actual amp and was literally pulling preamp tubes, and the real amp going, I'm going to double check just how hard the preamp is hitting the power tubes.
Right.
And gain staging the preamp tubes, all these crazy versions of the ATU and X7s, and going back into the plugin and actually rebiasing things. You know, it probably would have been easier for us just to have made it deluxe. Right. Physically, because you know, when you're sitting there going, well, it's, you know, it should be 30% biased under gain in a regular AX7, and I'm double checking things, because that was where the feel comes from. Because I think, unfortunately, if you were to play a high gain amp, if I take any high gain amp, for example, usually you're buying that high gain amp because it's got preamp gain, and the power amp is just sort of there to get you nice and loud. Where this amp's magic is the way the preamp gain is kind of getting crunchy, and then it's layering into the power section, which is then adding its own power tube distortion, transformer distortion. It's also reacting with the speaker impedance. So then, as you find out, I think most amp techs know, if a speaker says it's 8 ohms and you're actually hitting it with an amp, it's not 8 ohms, it's all over the place. So then that becomes a whole nother part of this breathing tone circuit, which is another reason why you know, we're not disconnecting the speaker from the amp. Like this is actually breathing like a real amp. You know, because it's the speaker has to actually load down the amp.
Right.
The way this thing works is it's actually getting hot as you keep playing and turn it up.
Right.
And the impedance is changing, and but those are the things that allow me to do this and just put the amp on 12. And it's sort of a recovery thing. I can play it and make it crap out. If I just do it with my fingers, I'll play lighter and it'll start cleaning up. And those are things you do with that real amp, which, again, we weren't going to put this out until you could actually truly play the guitar like you were playing a tune. Like even now, one of the most difficult things you can do with these plugins is actually turn your guitar down to almost nothing. And then it's kind of still down there. So while it seems insignificant to go, well, what do we care if the person turns their guitar down to like 0.5%? It makes a big deal, because I can play down at 0.5% just by doing this. And that is the whole reason this thing actually feels like an amp. Again, all the little things that would typically get skipped over, like, well, it sounds fine. You know, it's like, well, no, we're playing it now.
Right.
And again, one of the tests would be playing this and then, again, playing against 2 real amps.
Right.
So again, and someone finally asked me, like, how do you not go crazy after your several thousand hours of listening to the same material through this plugin, through an amp, through the next amp, back and forth all day long? And you don't get tired, and when you realize, you know, you're trying to get to the other side of that. You're looking for the gold. You're looking for that. It's like the runner. If you stop middle of running, you're going to fall over and die. Right. But you know, when you're at mile 100, you're like, nope, not stopping until you get to the goal line. So it was an exciting project for me and Dave Berners and the graphic guys they actually learned how to 3D render the Tweed onto the amp. You know, who designed all the microphones and the GUI interface with everybody just really pitched in to want to make this the best we possibly could, even though it looks very simple.
Awesome.
I think that was the whole point. Like, you can't mess it up. I hope somebody turns all the knobs, some places I didn't even think of yet. and does something cool with it, you know.
Right. Awesome. Well, congratulations. It really is an amazing accomplishment. So much like a real amp. I mean, basically, it's a real amp.
Yeah, it's just missing the burning dust smell.
Yeah.
You know, which our rooms had a lot of when we were doing this.
I bet. So James, to wrap the video up, why don't I have you play out through a bunch of the presets here, and then we'll switch over to a 335. We can hear what some humbuckers sound like through it as well.
Fantastic.
It's going to be fun.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining me for Sweetwater's Guitars and Gear. I'm Mitch Gallagher.